If someone had asked my family to describe me in one word, they wouldn't have said kind. They wouldn't have said strong. They definitely wouldn't have said successful. No, the word they loved most was failure. For 28 years, that label followed me everywhere. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday dinner, every family photo. It hung over my head like a storm cloud no one wanted to chase away. In my family, success only wore one white coat if you weren't saving lives. If your name wasn't followed by MD, then you weren't really someone worth celebrating. My father was a famous cardiologist. My older brother was a neurosurgeon. My younger sister was the youngest oncology resident ever accepted into her hospital. Then there was me, Lauren Mitchell, the daughter who painted sunsets instead of studying anatomy, the daughter who believed people needed hope just as much as medicine, the daughter everyone whispered about when they thought I couldn't hear. Such wasted potential. She's too emotional. What a disappointment. Even strangers knew me as, "Oh, you're Dr. Mitchell's daughter." Never simply Lauren, never enough. Eventually, I stopped trying to prove them wrong, because when the people who are supposed to love you only measure your worth against someone else, you begin believing they're right, so I left. No dramatic goodbye, no screaming, no tears. I packed one suitcase. I left my apartment key on the kitchen counter. And I drove away from Boston before sunrise, promising myself I'd never beg for my family's love again. 7 years passed, 7 birthdays, 7 Christmas mornings spent with friends who slowly became family, 7 years of silence. Then one invitation arrived, cream-colored envelope, gold lettering. "My sister Emily Mitchell requests the honor of your presence, her wedding." I laughed when I opened it, not because it was funny, because after 7 years. The first words my family had sent me weren't, "We miss you." They weren't, "How are you?" They were, "Please attend." I almost threw it away. Maybe I should have, because none of us knew. That wedding would uncover a secret buried for 35 years. A secret my mother had carried alone. A secret that would destroy everything my father had built. And finally tell me why I was never treated like everyone else. My name is Lauren Mitchell. I'm 35 years old. And this is the story of how the daughter everyone called the family failure became the one person who could finally set us all free. Welcome back to Inspired Real Events, where ordinary people meet impossible family and the quiet ones learn the loudest lessons. If betrayal, gratitude, and slow burn justice are your thing, you're in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. People always assume childhood memories fade. Mine never did. Some memories become sharper with time. I was 6 years old the first time I realized my family wasn't like everyone else's. Dad came home wearing blue scrubs after a 16-hour surgery. Emily ran toward him. "So," his face lit up, "I got an A on my science project." He lifted her into the air like she'd won the Olympics. "My brilliant little doctor." She laughed so hard she hiccuped. A minute later, I ran over carrying my own project. It wasn't science, it was a painting. A giant sunflower field beneath a glowing orange sunset. I'd spent 3 days making it. Every petal had tiny brushstrokes. I'd even mixed my own colors because the yellow in the store wasn't warm enough. "Daddy," he barely looked. "What is it, Lauren?" "I made this for school." He glanced for maybe 2 seconds. "That's nice." Then he turned back toward Emily. "So tell me more about your experiment." I stood there holding the painting, waiting. Surely he'd come back. Surely he'd ask another question. He never did. Mom walked past me carrying groceries. "Lauren, don't stand in the hallway." That was all. Later that night, I heard them talking in the kitchen. Emily's project sat proudly on the dining table. My painting leaned against the trash can. Dad sighed. "Lauren's creative," Mom answered quietly. "Not every child has to become a doctor," Dad chuckled. "No. But she should at least do something meaningful." Something meaningful. I was 6. That sentence lived inside me for nearly 30 years. By middle school, comparisons had become a family tradition. Emily scored 98 on a chemistry exam. Everyone celebrated with dinner at her favorite Italian restaurant. I won first place in a statewide art competition. Dad looked at the certificate. "That's nice." Then he asked, "How are your math grades?" I remember smiling anyway. Maybe next time. Maybe if I worked harder. Maybe if I won something bigger. Maybe then. There was always another maybe. When I turned 16, my guidance counselor asked what universities I wanted to apply to. "I want to study visual storytelling." She smiled. "You're talented." For the first time, an adult saw something in me. I floated home that afternoon. I couldn't wait to tell my parents. Dad was reading medical journals. "I've decided what I want to study," without looking up. "Medicine." No, silence. I want to become an illustrator. The room became so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking. Dad slowly removed his glasses. Excuse me, I want to tell stories through art. He stared at me as though I'd confessed to a crime. You have the grades to become a physician. I know, so why would you waste them? I wouldn't be wasting them. His voice became colder. You'll regret throwing your future away. I don't think I will. You don't think. His words hit harder than he probably intended. You feel. Mom sat beside him. She didn't defend me. She simply folded another napkin. Your father only wants what's best. I wanted to ask, what's best for who? But I swallowed the question, because in our house, keeping the peace usually meant sacrificing myself. Graduation came. Emily had already been accepted into one of the country's top medical schools. My acceptance letter arrived from one of the finest art and design colleges in New York. I cried when I opened it. Not because I was scared, because someone believed in me. Scholarship included. I ran downstairs. Dad, he looked over the newspaper. I got in. Medical school? No, his smile disappeared before it fully formed. Oh, no hug, no congratulations, no celebration. That evening, my parents hosted 30 relatives. Everyone congratulated Emily. Her acceptance banner covered the living room wall. No one mentioned mine. My aunt eventually noticed the envelope sitting on the counter. Oh, Lauren, where are you going? I smiled. New York. Doing what? Art school. The room fell silent. Someone awkwardly changed the subject. Another uncle laughed. Well, every family needs one dreamer. Everyone laughed, everyone except me. Dad didn't stop them. Mom didn't either. I excused myself and walked upstairs. I sat on the bedroom floor. Not crying. Not yet, just staring at the acceptance letter. The paper had begun to wrinkle beneath my fingers. I whispered something to myself that night. One day, someone will be proud of me, even if that someone has to be me. I didn't know it then, but that promise would become the reason I survived everything that came next. And I had no idea that the hardest betrayal wasn't waiting in college. It was waiting inside my own family. The summer before I left for New York should have been one of the happiest seasons of my life. Instead, it became the season that convinced me I would never truly belong in my own family. Every morning, our house revolved around one person, Emily. She had become the shining star of the Mitchell family. Relatives called almost daily. How's our future oncologist? Neighbors stopped by with flowers. Dad proudly displayed her acceptance letter in a mahogany frame above the fireplace, right next to his medical degree. Visitors noticed it immediately. They'd smile and congratulate her. Then their eyes would drift toward me. So, Lauren, what are you studying again? Before I could answer, Dad usually stepped in. She's taking a different path. Different. It was such a harmless word. Yet somehow in our house, it always sounded like a polite way of saying less than. One Saturday morning, Mom asked us to clean out the attic. Emily rolled her eyes. I've got anatomy reading. Dad looked at her proudly. Your education comes first. Then he turned to me. Lauren, you can handle it. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs alone. Dust floated through the sunlight pouring in from the tiny attic window. Old Christmas decorations, boxes of childhood clothes, stacks of photo albums. Hours passed before I found a faded cardboard box marked simply. Laurien, a smile spread across my face. Maybe Mom had saved my childhood drawings. Maybe there were old birthday cards, maybe. I carefully opened the box. Inside were dozens of paintings. Finger paintings, elementary school sketches, middle school art competition ribbons, every single one had been folded. Some had coffee stains. Several were bent nearly in half. At the bottom sat a newspaper clipping. My statewide art competition, first place. I remembered that day. The principal had called my parents personally. Neither of them came. Dad had been performing surgery. Mom stayed at the hospital to support him. I'd accepted the award alone. My art teacher had hugged me afterward. I'm proud of you. Those 4 words had carried me for years. As I stared into that box, another memory surfaced. Just a few feet away sat another container. White, perfectly preserved. It read, EMILY curiosity got the better of me. Inside, everything was different. Her kindergarten report cards were laminated. Every participation ribbon had its own plastic sleeve. Tiny science projects were wrapped carefully in tissue paper. A clay volcano she'd made at age 9 still sat untouched. Not a crack, not a speck of dust. Every achievement had been protected like a priceless museum artifact. I looked back at my own box. The lid barely fit because everything had been tossed inside without care. It wasn't the objects that hurt. It was what they represented. No one treasures something they don't value. I quietly closed both boxes. Something inside me shifted that afternoon. Not anger, not yet, just understanding. The following week, Dad invited several surgeons over for dinner. It was one of those evenings where expensive wine flowed freely, conversations revolved around hospitals, and every sentence seemed to contain words I barely understood. Emily fit in perfectly. "So what specialty are you considering?" one doctor asked. "Oncology." "Excellent choice." They nodded with admiration. Eventually, someone remembered I existed. "And Lauren," I smiled politely, "I'll be studying illustration and visual storytelling." Silence, a woman chuckled. "Oh," another guest tilted his head. "So, children's books?" "I haven't decided." Dad laughed into his glass. "She has a vivid imagination." Everyone smiled politely. Someone changed the subject before I could say another word. I sat there finishing my mashed potatoes, suddenly feeling about 6 years old again, invisible. That night, Mom knocked softly on my bedroom door. She carried folded laundry. "I know dinner was awkward." I forced a smile. "It's okay," she hesitated. "Your father doesn't mean to hurt your feelings." I didn't say he did. "He worries." "Worries about what?" "That life will be difficult." I looked at her. "No," she frowned. "What?" "He worries I'll embarrass him." Her face changed. Only for a second, long enough for me to know I'd spoken the truth. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I hope someday you'll understand." Without another word, she left. I sat there staring at the closed door. That sentence echoed through my mind. "I hope someday you'll understand." Understand what, at the time, I thought she meant Dad's expectations. Years later, I'd realized she meant something far bigger. New York changed everything. For the first time in my life, no one introduced me as Dr. Mitchell's daughter. I was simply Lauren. Students loved my sketches. Professors challenged me. I stayed in the art studio until midnight most evenings. I wasn't trying to be the best anymore. I was finally becoming myself. My roommate, Sophie, became my closest friend. She came from Ohio. Her father fixed air conditioners. Her mother worked in a grocery store. One evening, we sat on the fire escape eating cheap pizza. "So," she smiled. "What's your family like?" I laughed. "You sure you want the long version? We've got all night." I told her everything. The comparisons, the silence. Dinners, the constant feeling of never being enough. When I finished, Sophie stared at me as though I'd described another planet. "My parents couldn't care less what I studied." "You're lucky." "No," she shook her head. "They're lucky." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "They have a daughter who lights up whenever she talks about art." I looked away. "No one back home sees that." She nudged my shoulder. "That's their loss." No one had ever said those words to me before. Their loss. For the first time, I wondered. Maybe I wasn't the problem. By my second year, my illustrations were winning national student awards. One of my professors recommended me for an internship with a publishing company in Manhattan. It was my dream opportunity. When I called home, Dad answered. "Hello." "Dad, I got the internship." "Doing what?" "Illustration." A pause. "Does it pay?" "Not much." Another pause. "Emily just published her first cancer research paper." I closed my eyes. "That's great." "You should congratulate her." "I will." "And Lauren?" "Yeah. I hope someday you'll find something stable." The call ended less than a minute later. I stared at my phone. Not once had he said congratulations. Not once had he asked if I was happy. That Christmas, I came home carrying a wrapped gift for everyone. For Dad, I'd spent nearly 3 months painting our family home in winter. Every brick, every snow-covered tree, every tiny detail. I even included the old porch swing where he'd once pushed me as a little girl. Back when I still believed he adored me. Christmas morning arrived. Everyone opened gifts. Emily received an expensive watch. My brother received a new surgical microscope. Mom received diamond earrings. Dad finally opened my painting. He studied it for a few seconds. "It's well done." Hope fluttered inside me. Then he smiled politely. "You've always been talented." He leaned the painting against the wall. Still wrapped in protective paper. He never hung it. Not that day, not the next. Months later, I found it in the basement, still unopened. Still leaning against the same wall, covered in dust. That was the day I stopped making art for my family. From then on, I created it for people who actually looked at it. Little did I know, someone had been quietly watching me all along. Someone who believed in my work far more than my own father ever had. And that person was about to change the direction of my life forever. People like to believe there's always one dramatic moment that breaks a family apart. A slammed door, a screaming match, a shattered vase. My family didn't fall apart like that. It unraveled quietly, thread by thread. Until one day, there was simply nothing left to hold us together. A week after Christmas, I received an email from the publishing company in Manhattan. I had been offered a full-time position after graduation. Not just any position. They wanted me to illustrate a series of children's books written by one of the country's best-selling authors. I read the email 5 times before it finally felt real. My hands trembled. I laughed out loud in my tiny apartment. Then I cried, not because I was afraid, because for the first time, someone I deeply admired believed I belonged. I immediately called Sophie. She screamed so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. I knew it. Lauren, I knew it. When she finally calmed down, she asked the question I had been avoiding. So, have you told your parents yet? I smiled nervously. Not yet. You should. I know. Maybe this time they'll finally see you. I wanted to believe her. I really did. That weekend, I drove back to Boston. The house looked exactly the same. The flower beds were perfectly trimmed. Dad's silver Merced sat in the driveway. Mom's wind chimes danced softly in the winter breeze. For a brief moment, I felt like a little girl again. Walking toward the front door, hoping today might finally be different. Emily was already home. She wrapped me in a quick hug. It's been forever. You look exhausted, she laughed. Residency. We walked inside together. The smell of roasted chicken filled the house. Mom smiled when she saw me. There you are. She hugged me tightly. For just a second longer than usual, I noticed it. At the time, I didn't understand why. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Dad talked about a complicated heart surgery. My brother shared stories from the emergency room. Emily described her oncology rotation. Everyone listened with admiration. Then Dad turned to me. So, I straightened in my chair. How's New York? Actually, I couldn't stop smiling. I have some news. Emily grinned. This sounds important. It is. I reached into my bag and placed the offer letter on the table. I got hired. Mom looked genuinely excited. Oh, Lauren. Dad adjusted his glasses. Hired where? I explained everything. The publishing company, the best-selling author, the salary, the benefits. The chance to illustrate books that would be sold across America. I expected silence. Instead, Dad laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough. The world always needs coloring books. The room froze. I blinked. It's not coloring books. I know, he shrugged. I'm saying it's not exactly changing the world. Something inside my chest tightened. I'll be creating stories for children. They'll grow out of them. I stared at him. Stories matter. So does medicine. They're different. They're not equal. The words landed like stones. Mom quietly looked down at her plate. Emily shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. Dad continued eating as though he'd merely commented on the weather. I swallowed hard. I worked 4 years for this. I'm aware. I stopped. What? I thought you'd be proud, he sighed. Lauren, that sigh, I'd heard it my whole life, the sigh that always came before disappointment. You confuse happiness with achievement. I frowned. What does that even mean? It means people applaud dreams. He pointed toward Emily. The world rewards results. I looked at my sister. She wasn't smiling anymore. Neither was my brother, even they knew he'd gone too far. After dinner, I found Mom washing dishes. The kitchen window reflected tiny snowflakes outside. She didn't turn around. You should ignore your father. I've spent 28 years doing that. The sponge stopped moving. He loves you. I laughed quietly. No, she looked at me. Don't say that. Then tell me one time. She frowned. One time he chose me first. Silence. One time he celebrated something I loved. More silence. One time he defended me. Tears filled her eyes. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out because there wasn't an answer. I nodded slowly. I thought so. I barely slept that night. Around 2 a.m, I went downstairs for water. As I passed Dad's study, I noticed the light was still on. His voice drifted through the half-open door. He was on the phone. Emily will carry on the Mitchell name. A pause. No, Lauren never had the discipline. Another pause. I've accepted that. I should have kept walking. Instead, I stood there. Some children simply don't have what it takes. I closed my eyes, every word sliced deeper than the last. Then he said something I would never forget. Sometimes I wonder how she came from this family. The glass slipped from my hand. It shattered across the hardwood floor. The conversation stopped. Dad opened the door. His face hardened. You were listening. No, I looked at the broken glass. I was walking by. He glanced at the mess. You should clean that up. Not. Are you okay? Not. Did you cut yourself? Just. Clean it up. I looked down. A shard had sliced my palm. Blood slowly dripped onto the floor. Neither of us moved. Mom rushed in first. Oh my God. She grabbed my hand. Dad simply picked up the phone. I'll call you back. He walked away. The next morning, I packed my suitcase before sunrise, not angrily, calmly, methodically. I folded every sweater, every sketchbook, every memory. Mom knocked softly. "You're leaving already? I have work." She knew that wasn't the real reason. She sat on the edge of my bed. "I wish things were different." "So do I." She reached for my hand. The cut from the broken glass had already been stitched. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "Everything." Her eyes said it, her lips didn't. Instead, she whispered, "Your father." I interrupted gently. "No." She looked confused. "This isn't about Dad anymore." "What do you mean?" "I've spent my whole life trying to earn love that should have been free." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I can't do it anymore." She hugged me tightly, so tightly I could barely breathe. When she finally let go, she kissed my forehead. It felt different, longer, as though she feared it might be the last chance she'd ever have. I smiled sadly. "Take care of yourself, Mom." "You too." I picked up my suitcase, walked downstairs, opened the front door. No one else came to say goodbye. Not Dad, not Emily. Not my brother, just Mom. She stood on the porch as I drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw her wipe away tears. Then she whispered something I couldn't hear. 7 years later. She would repeat those exact words. Only this time, I'd finally understand what she'd been trying to tell me. That morning marked the beginning of 7 years of silence. No birthday calls, no holiday dinners, no family photos. Only the quiet determination to build a life where I never had to beg to be seen again. I had no idea that the person who would help me do that was waiting just around the corner, and that meeting them would change not only my future, but the way I saw my own worth forever. The hardest part about leaving your family isn't the silence. It's discovering how peaceful life can be without constantly wondering whether you're enough. For the first few months after I left Boston, I kept expecting my phone to ring. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas morning, I'd glance at the screen. Nothing. At first, I'd tell myself they were busy. Doctors always were. Then I told myself maybe Dad was still angry. Eventually, I stopped making excuses, because 7 months passed. Then a year, not a single call. Not even a text that simply read, "How are you?" The little girl inside me finally understood something the grown woman had been refusing to accept. You can't miss someone who never truly made room for you. New York had a rhythm all its own. People hurried everywhere, coffee in one hand, ambition in the other. No one knew my father. No one cared that my sister was becoming one of the youngest oncology specialists in Boston. To everyone around me, I was just Lauren Mitchell, the illustrator with paint on her jeans and charcoal dust on her fingertips. And somehow, that felt wonderful. The publishing company occupied the top 3 floors of an old brick building in Manhattan. The elevator groaned every morning as if it hated Mondays even more than we did. The walls were lined with framed book covers that had shaped millions of childhoods. I used to stop and stare at them before clocking in. One day, I whispered to myself, maybe one of mine will be here someday. It sounded impossible. Still, it made me smile. My editor, Grace Harper, believed in me before I believed in myself. She was in her early 50s with silver streaks running through dark hair she never bothered to dye. She had a habit of reading manuscripts while eating peanut butter crackers. Crumbs ended up everywhere. One afternoon, she walked into my office carrying a stack of sketches. She placed them on my desk. "These yours?" I nodded nervously. She looked at me for several seconds, then smiled. "Lauren, yes. You don't just draw pictures," I frowned. "You tell people how to feel." No one had ever described my work that way, not teachers, not classmates, certainly not my parents. Grace continued, "That's rare." I felt my throat tighten. "Thank you," she shrugged casually. "Don't thank me." She tapped the papers. "Thank your heart." I laughed. "You make it sound easy." "Oh, honey," she smiled. "It never is." The first children's book we published together became an unexpected success. Parents sent letters. Teachers emailed photographs of classrooms reading it together. Little kids drew pictures of my characters and mailed them to the office. One afternoon, a box arrived addressed to me. Inside were over 200 hand-drawn thank you cards from an elementary school in Ohio. Crayons, glitter, misspelled words, stick figures. One little girl had written, "Your bunny looked lonely like me." How I don't feel lonely anymore. I stared at the note for nearly 5 minutes. Then I quietly closed my office door. I cried harder than I had in years, not because I was sad, because someone I'd never met understood exactly what I'd been trying to create. Hope. That tiny card meant more to me than every compliment I'd spent my childhood chasing. A few weeks later, Grace knocked gently on my office door. "You busy?" "Not really." She sat across from me. "I want you to meet someone." "Who?" A journalist, I blinked. Why? He wants to interview the creative team behind the new series. I'm not good with interviews, she laughed. Neither am I. The journalist arrived 20 minutes later. He was taller than I expected. Dark brown hair, kind eyes, a leather notebook tucked under one arm. He smiled the moment we shook hands. I'm Ethan Brooks. Lauren, I know, he grinned. I've been looking at your artwork all morning. I laughed awkwardly. Hopefully that's a good thing. It is. He flipped open his notebook. I've interviewed athletes, actors, politicians. He paused. But I've never interviewed someone who can make a fox look heartbroken. I burst into laughter. It caught me completely off guard. So that's your opening question? No, he smiled. I just wanted to make you laugh first. The interview lasted almost 2 hours. We talked about storytelling, childhood, books, dreams. Not once did he ask me what my parents did. Not once did he compare me to anyone else. When we finished, he packed his notebook away. I have one last question, I smiled. Go ahead. What made you start drawing? Without thinking, I answered honestly. I wanted to create worlds where everyone belonged. His expression softened. That's a beautiful answer. No one had ever called anything about me beautiful before, at least. Not the parts that mattered most. A week later, his article was published. The headline read, "The woman teaching children that different doesn't mean broken." Grace marched into my office waving the newspaper. You've got to read this. I scanned the article. Halfway down the page, one sentence stopped me cold. Lauren Mitchell doesn't create stories to escape reality. She creates them so children facing difficult realities remember they deserve love anyway. I hadn't said those exact words, yet somehow. He'd understood. Grace smiled knowingly. He sees your work. I quietly folded the newspaper. I think he sees me. Ethan and I became friends, then close friends. Some evenings we'd walk through Central Park after work. Other nights we'd sit in tiny diners eating pancakes at midnight. He never rushed conversations. He listened, really listened. One rainy evening he asked gently, "Can I ask something personal?" "You can try." "What happened with your family?" I stared out the cafe window. Raindrops slid slowly down the glass. I spent most of my life trying to earn a love everyone else received for free. He didn't interrupt. My father only respected success that looked like his. "And your mother?" I hesitated. "She loved me. I can hear that." But I swallowed. "She never protected me." The words felt heavy. Ethan nodded slowly. "Sometimes people confuse silence with keeping peace." I looked at him. "My mother did." "No," he shook his head gently. "She survived it." That sentence stayed with me long after we left the cafe. Maybe Mom hadn't been choosing silence. Maybe she'd been trapped inside it. 2 years later, I published my first book as both writer and illustrator. On release day, the office held a small celebration. There was cake, balloons, too many photographs. Grace handed me the very first printed copy. "Go ahead." I opened it carefully. There, beneath the title, were the words I'd dreamed of seeing since I was 16. Written and illustrated by Lauren Mitchell, I ran my fingers over the cover. For a moment, I imagined Dad holding the book, imagined him smiling, imagined him saying, "I'm proud of you." The fantasy disappeared as quickly as it came. Some dreams are meant to inspire you. Others are meant to teach you when to let go. I slipped the book into my bag. That night, instead of mailing a copy to Boston, I donated the first edition to the elementary school that had sent me those handwritten cards. They had believed in me before my own family ever did. It felt right. Life kept moving. Books became bestsellers. Schools invited me to speak. Parents recognized me at bookstores. Children hugged me with sticky hands and enormous smiles. For the first time in my life, strangers celebrated the very thing my family had dismissed. I was no longer surviving. I was living. Then, exactly 7 years after I walked out of my parents' house, a cream-colored envelope appeared in my mailbox. Boston return address, elegant handwriting. The name Mitchell written across the back. My heart skipped. I already knew who it was from before I opened it. Inside was a wedding invitation. Emily Mitchell was getting married. And beneath the invitation was a handwritten note in my mother's unmistakable script. Just one sentence. "Please come. There are things you deserve to know." I read it again, then again. For 7 years, my mother had remained silent. Now, she was asking me to come home. I had no idea that accepting that invitation would force every secret in the Mitchell family into the light, and that my mother's first words to me at the wedding would change everything I believed about my life. For 7 years, my family had become a collection of memories, some beautiful, most painful. I had learned to live without phone calls that never came, without birthday cards, without holiday dinners where I always felt like an unwanted guest. The silence had stopped hurting. Eventually, it had simply become normal. Then one handwritten sentence changed everything. Please come. There are things you deserve to know. I must have read those 10 words 50 times. They didn't sound like my mother. She was careful, measured. She never hinted at anything mysterious. If she wanted to say something, she'd usually say almost nothing at all. This felt different, urgent, almost desperate. Ethan found me sitting in our apartment that evening with the invitation spread across the coffee table. He hung his coat by the door and immediately noticed my expression. What happened? I slid the envelope toward him. My sister's getting married. He picked it up carefully. So, he looked at me. You're going? I don't know. He sat beside me. You've been staring at that invitation for an hour. I've been trying to figure out why now. He read my mother's note twice, then placed it back on the table. What does your gut say? I laughed softly. My gut says get back in bed and pretend the mail never arrived. And your heart? I looked down. My heart wants to know why she wrote this. Grace had a habit of appearing exactly when I needed advice. The next morning, she walked into my office carrying 2 coffees. You look like you didn't sleep. I didn't. She raised an eyebrow. Family, I smiled weakly. How did you know? 'Cause work problems make people angry. She handed me a cup. Family problems make people tired. I told her everything, the invitation, the note, the 7 years of silence. When I finished, she stirred her coffee quietly. Finally, she spoke. You know. What? Closure doesn't always come wrapped in apologies. I frowned. What do you mean? Sometimes. She looked out the window. You go back not because they deserve another chance. She smiled gently. You go because you deserve answers. For the next week, I carried the invitation in my handbag. Every time I reached for my wallet, I saw it. Every time I zipped the bag closed, I felt its edges. It was as though my past had quietly climbed back into my life. One afternoon, while signing books at a local bookstore, a little boy tugged on my sleeve. He couldn't have been older than 8. Miss Mitchell, hi there. My mom says your books are about brave people. I smiled. I hope so. He thought for a second. Are you brave? Children ask questions adults spend years avoiding. I looked at him. I'm trying to be. He nodded as if that was the perfect answer. Then he hugged me before running back to his mother. That tiny moment stayed with me all afternoon. Maybe bravery wasn't the absence of fear. Maybe it was showing up despite it. That evening, I booked my flight to Boston. The airplane landed just after 4 in the afternoon. As the wheels touched the runway, my stomach tightened. Boston hadn't changed. The harbor still shimmered beneath the autumn sun. The skyline looked exactly as I remembered. Even the crisp air smelled familiar. It was strange how a city could make you feel 12 years old again. I rented a car. Halfway to my hotel, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Hello. Silence then. Lauren. Mom. Her voice was softer than I remembered. Older, more fragile. It's me. I know. Another silence settled between us. 7 years is a long time to fit into one conversation. Finally, she whispered, You came. I said I would. I wasn't sure you'd believe me. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. I almost didn't. She inhaled slowly. Thank you. Those 2 words caught me off guard. She had never thanked me for simply existing before. I'll see you tomorrow. Before I could ask anything else, she ended the call. The rehearsal dinner was held at a historic hotel overlooking the Charles River. Elegant chandeliers filled the ballroom with warm light. Laughter echoed from every corner. Doctors, lawyers, hospital administrators, old family friends. Almost every face looked familiar. Almost every face remembered me as the artistic daughter. As soon as I stepped inside, conversations slowed. Heads turned. Someone whispered, Is that Lauren? I haven't seen her in years. I thought she moved away. Another voice answered quietly. I heard she's an author now. The whisper carried across the room. Actually, she's pretty successful. Pretty successful. It almost made me laugh. For years, success had only mattered when it belonged to someone else. Now strangers were defending me. Life had a strange sense of humor. Emily spotted me first. She crossed the room in seconds. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she threw her arms around me. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't either. She pulled back, her eyes immediately filled with tears. You look. What? Happy. No one in my family had ever used that word to describe me. I smiled. I am, she nodded slowly. I'm glad. There was something different about her. She still carried herself with the confidence of a surgeon, but the sharp edges were gone. The competitiveness, the constant need to impress, it had all softened. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I blinked. For what? She looked down. For a lot of things. Before I could answer, someone called her name. The bride was needed elsewhere. She squeezed my hand. "We'll talk." Then she disappeared into the crowd, leaving me with more questions than answers. A waiter offered me champagne. I politely declined. I wasn't ready for anything to cloud my thoughts. As I wandered through the ballroom, I stopped in front of a wall covered with family photographs. Emily's childhood, medical school, graduation, residency, awards, there were dozens. Then I noticed something else near the very end. A newer picture. My latest author portrait, the one from the back cover of my best-selling book. I stared at it, confused. Someone had added it beside the others. Beneath it, a small silver plaque simply read, "Lauren Mitchell, best-selling author and illustrator." My heart skipped. Who had done that? Certainly not Dad. A familiar voice answered the question before I could ask it. "I put it there." I turned. Mom stood a few feet away. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her dark hair had become almost completely silver. Tiny lines framed her eyes, but those eyes, they looked exactly the same, full of words she'd never spoken. "You," she nodded. "You deserved to be there." I couldn't speak. For 7 years, I'd imagined this reunion 100 different ways. None of them looked like this. She stepped closer. "So many people asked about you. And I told them the truth." I frowned. "What truth?" A faint smile touched her lips. "That you're one of the most successful people in this family." I stared at her. Those words. They felt impossible. Like hearing someone speak in a language I'd waited my whole life to understand. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed behind us. Dad, he looked older too. His shoulders weren't quite as straight. His confident walk had slowed. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. Our eyes met across the ballroom. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the first sentence he'd spoken directly to me in 7 years. "Lauren!" My name had never sounded so unfamiliar. I waited. So did he. But whatever he wanted to say, he couldn't. He simply nodded once and walked away. Mom watched him leave. Then she turned back to me. "There are things you don't know." I searched her face. "What things?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Tomorrow." She reached for my hand. "I promise." As she walked away, I noticed something I'd never seen before. She wasn't looking at Dad. She was watching me, as though she were counting the final hours before a secret she'd carried for 35 years could no longer remain hidden. I had come expecting an awkward wedding. Instead, I was standing on the edge of a truth that was about to shake every memory I'd ever had of my family. I barely slept. The hotel room was quiet, but my mind refused to be. Every conversation from the rehearsal dinner replayed over and over. Emily's apology, my father's silence, the photograph on the family wall, and my mother's promise. "Tomorrow." 3 syllables. Yet they carried 35 years of unanswered questions. I kept wondering if I'd imagined it all. Maybe she simply wanted to apologize. Maybe she wanted to explain why she'd stayed silent all those years. Or maybe there really was something far bigger waiting for me. At 5:30 in the morning, I gave up on sleep. I slipped on a sweater and walked outside. Boston was just waking up. The streets were almost empty. A light fog floated over the Charles River. For the first time since arriving, the city didn't feel haunted by memories. It felt peaceful. I found a small coffee shop a few blocks from the hotel. The smell of fresh cinnamon rolls filled the room. I ordered a latte and sat beside the window. Old habits die hard. Whenever life became overwhelming, I reached for my sketchbook. Within minutes, my pencil began moving. Without thinking, I drew a little girl standing outside a brightly lit house. Everyone inside was laughing. She stood alone on the porch, holding a painting behind her back. Halfway through the sketch, someone quietly pulled out the chair across from me. "You still draw when you're hurting." I looked up. Mom, she wore a simple navy coat and no makeup. For the first time in my life, she didn't look like Dr. Mitchell's elegant wife. She looked like a tired woman. I smiled faintly. "You always knew." "I always knew." She glanced at the drawing. "You've been carrying that little girl for a long time." I closed the sketchbook. "I don't carry her anymore." "No." I shook my head. "I became her." Mom looked away. Her eyes shimmered. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I owe you more apologies than I could ever say." I stared at her. "I stopped waiting for apologies years ago." "I know. Then why am I here?" She inhaled deeply. "Because today," her voice trembled, "I refuse to stay silent." My heartbeat quickened. "What does that mean?" She looked toward the window, watching people hurry down the sidewalk. "I need you to listen until I'm finished." I nodded. "I can do that." She smiled sadly. "You've always been better at listening than the rest of us." She didn't begin with a secret. She began with a memory. "You were 5. I frowned. "The elementary school talent show." I remembered it immediately. I had painted a giant mural with my classmates. Every parent had come, except mine. I waited by the stage for almost an hour. I know. I kept thinking you'd walk through the doors. Mom closed her eyes. I wanted to. So why didn't you? She swallowed hard. Your father wouldn't let me. The words landed softly, but they echoed inside me. What? He said Emily had a science competition the same afternoon. I remember. He told me, she hesitated, that only one event mattered. My stomach tightened. You could have come anyway. I should have. Her voice cracked. I should have. For the next hour, she told me stories I'd never heard. Little moments. Forgotten afternoons, invisible choices. Every single one had something in common. She had wanted to be there. Dad had convinced her otherwise. He always said we'd celebrate you another time. There never was another time. I know. He said Emily needed more encouragement. She already had all of it. I know. He believed focusing on one child wasn't cruelty. She wiped away a tear. He called it investing in the future. I sat there speechless. All those years, I had blamed them equally. Now I realized something painful. My mother hadn't been choosing favorites. She had been surrendering again and again and again. Why? I finally whispered. Why didn't you fight him? She laughed quietly, not because anything was funny, because some questions hurt too much to answer cleanly. When I married your father, she stared into her untouched coffee. He wasn't like that. What changed? Success, she smiled bitterly. The more respected he became, the more control he wanted. She nodded. He believed everything in life could be managed. She looked at me. Hospitals, schedules, people, even family. I leaned back. So we became another project. She whispered, yes. The wedding ceremony wasn't until late afternoon. Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I've told myself this story 1,000 times. What story? The one I'm finally going to tell. I looked into her eyes. Today, she nodded. Before the reception ends. Why today? She glanced toward the engagement ring on Emily's finger in a photo displayed on her phone. Because your sister deserves to begin her marriage without carrying our family's lies. Lies, plural. The word settled heavily between us. What lies? She slowly stood. Tonight. Mom, I promise. She gently kissed my forehead, just like she had the morning I left home, only this time. She didn't let go immediately. I'm so sorry, Lauren. Then she walked away, leaving me with 1,000 new questions. By early afternoon, the church was alive with excitement. Guests filled the pews. Music echoed beneath the stained glass windows. Emily looked radiant in her wedding dress. When she saw me, she smiled with genuine warmth. You came. I promised. She took my hands. I've wanted to tell you something. What is it? She looked around to make sure no one else was listening. I wasn't the golden child. I blinked. What? She laughed softly. I know that's what everyone thinks. It wasn't, she shook her head. I was the project. I frowned. I don't understand. Neither did I. She looked toward the front of the church where Dad stood greeting guests. I spent my whole life terrified. Terrified, every test, every grade, every residency evaluation. If I wasn't perfect, her smile disappeared. I wasn't enough either. The realization hit me like cold water. I'd spent years envying her, never realizing she'd been trapped inside a different cage. I thought Dad loved you more. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I thought he loved success more. Neither of us spoke. For the first time in our lives, we weren't rivals, we were sisters. Just before the ceremony began, Ethan slipped quietly into the church. I hadn't expected him until the reception. He smiled as he took the seat beside me. I couldn't stay away. You flew in this morning. I caught the first flight. You didn't tell me. I wanted to surprise you, I laughed. It worked. He reached for my hand. You okay? I looked toward my parents. No, he squeezed my fingers. But you're not alone. Those 5 words steadied me more than he probably realized. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Emily and Daniel exchanged vows with tears in their eyes. The guests laughed at the right moments. They cried at the heartfelt ones. Even Dad smiled. A genuine smile. Watching his youngest daughter begin a new chapter for a brief moment, I wondered if maybe families really could heal. Then I noticed Mom. She wasn't watching the bride. She wasn't watching the groom. She was staring at Dad, not with love, not with anger, with resolve. As if she'd already made a decision she could never take back. The reception began just after sunset. Crystal chandeliers reflected across hundreds of glasses. Soft piano music floated through the ballroom. Guests laughed. Children danced. The atmosphere felt warm, comfortable, safe. Then Emily stood and tapped her champagne glass. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Applause filled the room. She smiled. But before dinner, she looked toward Mom. Someone has something they needs to say. Every conversation stopped. The room fell silent. Mom slowly rose from her chair. Her hands trembled. Dad looked at her, confused. She didn't look back. Instead, she turned toward me. Our eyes met across the ballroom. I knew, whatever she was about to reveal, there would be no going back. The woman who had spent 35 years protecting everyone else's peace was finally ready to tell the truth. And before the night was over, every person in that ballroom, including me, would discover that the story of the Mitchell family had never been what it seemed. The applause faded. One by one, the conversations disappeared until the ballroom became so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the chandeliers overhead. More than 300 people sat frozen in their seats. Doctors, judges, business owners, hospital executives, friends who had known my family for decades. Every eye settled on my mother. She wasn't holding a glass. She wasn't carrying notes. She simply stood there, hands trembling ever so slightly. For the first time in my life, my mother looked terrified. Dad smiled politely, assuming she was about to give a heartfelt wedding toast. "Margaret," he said softly, "everyone's waiting." She looked at him. "I know." Her voice was calm, too calm. "I've kept everyone waiting for 35 years. A ripple of confusion spread across the room. Emily's smile faded. My brother slowly lowered his fork. I felt Ethan's hand gently wrap around mine beneath the table. Something was about to change forever. Mom took a slow breath. "I'd like to congratulate my daughter Emily and my new son-in-law, Daniel." Everyone smiled politely. "You deserve a marriage built on honesty." She paused. "Not silence." Dad shifted in his chair. "Margaret." She raised one hand. No, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, for the first time in their marriage. He stopped talking because she had asked him to. "I've spent most of my life protecting this family's reputation." She looked around the ballroom. "I told myself I was protecting my children." Her eyes found mine, but I wasn't. Tears welled in her eyes. "I was protecting fear." No one moved. "When Lauren was born," she smiled through tears, "your father held her for nearly an hour." I blinked. That wasn't the father I remembered. "He cried." Guests exchanged surprised looks. "He promised her she'd always be his little girl." Mom swallowed. "And for a while," she looked down, "he meant it." Dad stared at her. "Margaret, please." She didn't raise her voice. "I listened to you for 35 years. Her gaze remained steady. "Tonight, you'll listen to me." She turned back toward the guests. "When Lauren was 6, she painted a sunflower field." A lump formed in my throat. "I remember." "She waited all afternoon to show her father." She smiled sadly. He barely looked. Several people glanced toward Dad. His jaw tightened. "I watched my little girl carry that painting upstairs." Mom's voice cracked. "She thought no one noticed." She looked at me. "I noticed." My eyes filled. "You noticed." "I noticed everything." She closed her eyes. "Every award, every tear, every fake smile. I noticed every single one." I couldn't breathe for years. I'd believed no one had seen me. "Then why?" The words escaped before I could stop them. My voice echoed through the silent ballroom. "Why didn't you say anything?" Mom looked at me. For several seconds she couldn't speak. Finally, "Because I was weak." "No, you don't have to." "Yes." She shook her head. "I do." She wiped away a tear. "I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Losing my family." She laughed bitterly. "The cruelest part," she looked around the room, "was that I lost you anyway." No one made a sound. Even the waiters had stopped moving. Dad slowly stood. "This isn't the place." Mom met his eyes. "It's exactly the place. We can discuss this privately." She smiled sadly. "We've discussed it privately for 35 years. He inhaled sharply. "You're embarrassing this family." She looked around the ballroom. "No, I'm telling the truth." The sentence hit him harder than shouting ever could. Emily quietly stood beside our mother. She slipped one arm around her shoulders. "I'm with you, Mom." Dad looked stunned. "Emily." She shook her head. "I've spent my whole life trying to become someone you'd finally be satisfied with." His face softened. "You already were." "No," she smiled sadly. "I was useful." The room became even quieter. "I thought Lauren was jealous of me." Emily turned toward me. "I didn't realize she'd been grieving." I covered my mouth. She walked over and hugged me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The little girls we'd once been seemed to disappear. All that remained were two women who finally understood each other. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "So am I." My brother slowly approached. He had always been quieter than the rest of us, the peacemaker, the observer. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I owe you an apology too. You never hurt me." "I watched it happen." His voice broke. "And I said nothing." He lowered his head. "I was a coward." I reached forward and hugged him. "We were kids." No, he shook his head. I became an adult. I should have done better. Across the ballroom. Dad stood completely alone. Not one person had moved beside him, not because anyone hated him, because no one knew what to say. The man everyone admired, the brilliant surgeon, the respected leader, suddenly looked small, older, human. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, regret, real regret. He slowly walked toward me. Every step seemed heavier than the last. When he finally stopped in front of me, he struggled to meet my eyes. His voice cracked. It startled everyone, including him. I don't know how to begin. I looked at him quietly. He laughed once, a broken laugh. I always had the right words in an operating room. He glanced down, but somehow, I never found the right words for my own daughter. The sentence hung between us. I thought I was preparing you for a difficult world. He looked around the room. I never realized. I had become the difficult world. A tear slipped down his face. He didn't wipe it away. I told myself I was pushing you toward greatness. He smiled painfully. But all I really pushed you toward, his shoulders sagged, was the front door. I remembered that cold morning 7 years ago, my suitcase. Mom standing on the porch, Dad never coming outside. I waited, I said quietly, for one phone call. He closed his eyes. I know. I waited every birthday. Another tear rolled down his cheek. I know. I thought maybe you'd realize you missed me. His voice dropped to a whisper. I missed you every day. I searched his face. Then why didn't you call? The question I'd carried for 7 years finally left my lips. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out because there wasn't a good answer. Only silence. The same silence that had stolen so much from us. He nodded slowly. Because every day that passed, it became harder to admit how badly I'd failed. For the first time in my life, my father wasn't defending himself. He wasn't making excuses. He was simply standing in the wreckage he'd created. Mom stepped beside him. She reached into her small evening bag. I have one more thing. She removed a worn, cream-colored envelope. The edges were yellow with age. The paper looked decades old. My heart skipped. I should have given this to you years ago. She held it out to me. What is it? She took a shaky breath. A letter. From who? Her eyes filled with tears once more. Someone who wanted you to know the truth. I frowned. What truth? She whispered. The truth about the day you were born. The room seemed to disappear. Every sound faded. Every face blurred. I looked down at the old envelope in my hands. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were just 4 words, for Lauren. Someday, my fingers trembled as I stared at it. Whatever was inside that envelope had been hidden for 35 years. And deep inside, I knew that once I opened it, nothing about my life would ever be the same again. The envelope felt impossibly light. 35 years of silence, folded into a single piece of paper. My name was written in elegant blue ink, for Lauren. Someday. The handwriting wasn't my mother's. It wasn't my father's. I didn't recognize it at all. The ballroom remained completely silent. No one reached for their food. The band had quietly stepped away from the stage. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. 300 people watched as my fingers carefully broke the old seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age. It carried the faint scent of old books and cedar wood. I unfolded it slowly. Before I could read the first line, my vision blurred. Not because of tears, because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Ethan gently placed one hand against the small of my back. I'm here, I nodded once. Then I began to read. My dearest Lauren, if you're reading this, it means your mother finally found the courage I always prayed she would. I stopped. My mother quietly covered her mouth. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks. I looked at her. You've read this before, she nodded. Only once. When? The day it was written. My heartbeat quickened. I looked back at the page. There may come a day when you believe you were difficult to love. If that day ever arrives, I need you to know something. You were the easiest child to love I have ever known. A lump formed in my throat. I swallowed hard. The words continued. You smiled before you could walk. You laughed every time I sang to you. You reached for people who were hurting before you could even speak clearly. That kind of heart cannot be taught. It is a gift. My eyes closed for a moment. Someone had seen me. Someone had noticed those tiny things. Someone had loved me enough to remember them. I looked up. Who wrote this? Mom took a slow breath. My father, I blinked. My grandfather, she nodded. Your grandfather, William. Confusion washed over me. I barely remember him. You were only 4 when he passed away. Pieces of old memories floated through my mind, a warm laugh, a wooden rocking chair, the smell of peppermint candies, strong hands lifting me onto his shoulders, nothing more. He adored you, Mom whispered. He used to call you his little sunshine. I looked back at the letter. Lauren, your father believes greatness comes from achievement. I believe greatness comes from kindness. Those are not the same thing. One earns applause, the other changes lives. I heard quiet sniffles throughout the ballroom. Several guests wiped away tears. Even people who barely knew me seemed moved by the words. One day, people will measure your worth by titles, awards, and money. Don't make the mistake of believing them. The people who leave this world remembered most warmly are rarely the richest. They're the ones who made others feel loved. I couldn't stop crying now. Every sentence healed a wound I hadn't even realized was still open. Halfway down the page, my grandfather's handwriting became shakier, as though he'd been growing tired while writing. There is something else you deserve to know. The room grew even quieter. I felt my heart pounding in my ears. When you were born, your father didn't reject you. I frowned. He adored you. I looked instinctively toward Dad. He stood motionless. His eyes never left the floor. Everything changed after the accident. I looked back at the page. Accident? The hospital investigation nearly ended his career. A young patient died during emergency surgery. Gasps spread quietly through the room. Dad slowly closed his eyes. Although your father was eventually cleared of wrongdoing, something inside him changed forever. He became convinced that emotions made people weak. He buried his grief beneath perfection. Then he began expecting perfection from everyone around him. I slowly lowered the letter. I had never heard this story, not once, not in 35 years. I looked at Dad. Is it true? He nodded without speaking. Mom finally stepped forward. It happened 6 months after you were born, she spoke softly. The little girl was only 8. Dad's hands trembled. I replayed that surgery every night for years. His voice barely carried across the ballroom. I stopped sleeping. I stopped laughing. I stopped feeling anything. He swallowed hard. I thought if I became perfect. His eyes filled. No family would ever lose another child. No one judged him. No one interrupted. They simply listened for the first time. He wasn't Dr. Mitchell. He was a grieving man who had never learned how to grieve. But, I whispered, what did that have to do with me? His answer came immediately. Nothing. That single word broke my heart more than anything else. I made it about you. His voice cracked. You were simply the child who happened to grow up while I was becoming someone I no longer recognized. He looked directly into my eyes. You paid the price for wounds you never caused. Silence settled over the ballroom once again. This time, it felt different. Not heavy, not angry, honest. I looked back at my grandfather's letter. Only one paragraph remained. Lauren, if life ever convinces you that you don't belong in your own family, remember this instead. Families are not defined by the people who share your name. They're defined by the people who choose your heart every single day. Find those people. Love them fiercely. Then become that person for someone else. I have no doubt you will. Love always, Grandpa William. The final word blurred beneath my tears. I carefully folded the letter exactly the way it had been folded decades earlier. Then I held it against my chest. For the first time in 35 years, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like someone's cherished granddaughter. Dad slowly walked toward me. No confidence remained, no pride, only humility. I can't ask you to forgive me. He looked down. I haven't earned that. I remained silent. I missed every chance to know the woman you've become. Another tear rolled down his face. And judging by everyone I've met tonight, he smiled sadly. The world was lucky enough to know her anyway. Those words struck me deeply, not because they erased the past, they couldn't, but because they were the first completely selfless words my father had ever spoken to me. He wasn't asking for absolution. He wasn't defending himself. He was grieving the years he had thrown away. I looked around the ballroom. Emily stood beside Daniel, quietly crying. My brother had one arm around Mom. Ethan smiled at me with gentle encouragement. Grace had flown in as a surprise guest and stood near the back of the room, tears streaming down her face. The family I had built, and the family I had lost, were standing together in the same room. Then my mother whispered something that made every head turn. There is one last truth. I looked at her. What else could there possibly be? She reached into her handbag once more. This time she removed a small velvet box. It wasn't jewelry. Inside was a tiny silver key. She placed it in my hand. Your grandfather left something for you. I frowned. What is this? She smiled through tears. A safety deposit box. What's inside? She shook her head. I promised him I would never open it. The room seemed to hold its breath again. He said, she looked directly at me, it belonged to you when you were finally ready to know your own worth. No one spoke. The tiny silver key rested in my palm, cool against my skin. It wasn't valuable because of the metal. It was valuable because someone had protected it for more than 3 decades. For me, I looked at my mother. "You've had this all these years," she nodded. "Since the week your grandfather died. And you never opened it. Never. You weren't curious." A faint smile crossed her face. "Every single day." She took a shaky breath. "But I loved my father enough to keep my promise." She gently closed my fingers around the key. "He said you'd know when the time was right." I looked around the ballroom. "I don't think he imagined this." "No," she laughed softly through tears. "I don't think any of us did." Emily walked over first. "So, what do we do now?" I looked at the key. "I guess we find out what's inside." Daniel checked his watch. "The bank closes in 45 minutes. Mom's eyes widened. "It's only a few blocks away." Dad finally spoke. "We can still make it." For a brief second, all of us looked at one another, 7 years without sharing a single meal. Now, we were about to drive across Boston together. Life had a strange way of writing endings no one could predict. The ballroom slowly emptied. Some guests hugged us quietly before leaving. Others simply nodded with understanding. No one asked intrusive questions. No one whispered. The wedding had become something entirely different than anyone had expected. It wasn't just the beginning of a marriage. It was the beginning of healing. 20 minutes later, we stood inside one of Boston's oldest banks. The marble floors echoed beneath our footsteps. An elderly manager greeted my mother warmly. "Mrs. Mitchell." She smiled politely. "We're here about William Carter's safety deposit box." He paused, his expression softened. "I remember your father." "So do I. He was a remarkable man." She looked at me. "He left instructions." The manager nodded. "He certainly did." He disappeared into a back office. A minute later, he returned carrying a long black metal box. "This has remained untouched for 31 years. 31 years, waiting, for one afternoon, for one daughter. For one family finally ready to face the truth. We entered a private viewing room. The manager unlocked the box, then quietly excused himself. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. No one moved. Finally, I slid the lid open. Inside were only 4 things: a leather journal, a sealed envelope, a small velvet pouch, and a faded photograph. I picked up the photograph first. It showed my grandfather sitting on the porch of his old farmhouse. I couldn't have been older than 3. I was sitting on his lap, covered in finger paint. Both of us were laughing, real laughter, the kind you can't fake. On the back, written in blue ink, were 6 simple words. "Never let them dim your light." I pressed the picture against my heart. "I don't even remember this day." Mom smiled through tears. "He did." Next, I opened the velvet pouch. Inside lay a tiny silver sunflower pendant. Emily gasped. "Oh my goodness." "What?" Mom covered her mouth. "You wore that every day." I did. "You were 4, she laughed quietly. "You refused to take it off." "What happened to it?" Mom looked down. "One day it disappeared." Dad slowly sat down in the corner of the room. "I threw it away." Everyone turned, his face crumpled. "I told her she was getting too old for childish things." My chest tightened. "You cried for 2 days." His voice broke completely. "I never knew your father found another one." Mom gently touched the pendant. "He never wanted you to know." I carefully placed the necklace around my neck. It rested just above my heart, somehow. It felt as though a missing piece of my childhood had found its way home. Then I reached for the envelope. Across the front, my grandfather had written, "Open this after reading my journal," so I set it aside. Only one thing remained, the leather journal. Its cover had become soft with age. The first page carried today's date. No, not today's, the date it had been written. 31 years ago. I began reading. "If you're holding this, Lauren, then you've survived long enough to become the woman I always believed you would be." I smiled through tears. He really had known me, even before I knew myself. The journal wasn't a diary. It wasn't filled with family secrets. Instead, it was page after page of observations, little memories. The first time I laughed so hard that milk came out of my nose. The afternoon I insisted on rescuing an injured robin. The day I cried because another little girl at preschool didn't have anyone to play with. He'd written everything down, every tiny act of kindness, every glimpse of the person I would become. I looked at Ethan. "I don't remember any of this." He smiled. "He wanted you to?" Halfway through the journal, one sentence stopped me cold. "The world will try to convince Lauren that her value depends on what she achieves." I slowly looked toward my father. My grandfather had understood years before anyone else. He had seen exactly what was happening. I continued reading. "If that day comes, I hope someone places this journal back into her hands, not so she remembers me, but so she remembers herself." I couldn't hold back my tears for my entire life. I'd been chasing proof that I mattered. My grandfather had spent his final years creating it, one page at a time. Finally, I reached the last entry. It had been written only 3 days before he died. The handwriting had become shaky, uneven, but every word remained perfectly clear. Margaret. I realized this part wasn't written to me. It was written to my mother. When Lauren grows older, don't protect her from disappointment. Protect her from believing disappointment defines her. One conversation can save a child years of loneliness. Don't wait as long as I did with my own son. My mother quietly broke down. She buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered it into the silence. "I'm so sorry." Then came the final sentence, the very last line my grandfather ever wrote. "Tell Lauren that I was proud of her long before the world discovered her name. No awards, no best-selling books, no interviews, no success. He had been proud of me, simply because I was me." That realization healed something words can barely describe. I carefully closed the journal. The room remained silent for a long time. Finally, Dad stood. He walked toward me slowly. "I spent 35 years trying to build a legacy." He looked at the journal in my hands. "Your grandfather already had one." He smiled sadly. "It wasn't a hospital. It wasn't awards. It was people." He looked directly into my eyes. "I finally understand that." Before anyone spoke again, I remembered the unopened envelope, the one my grandfather had instructed me to read last. My fingers slid beneath the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet, nothing more. I unfolded it carefully. At the very top were the words, "Lauren, if you're reading this, then you've already forgiven yourself." I frowned. Forgiven myself? For what? As I continued reading, my heart began pounding harder with every line, because my grandfather wasn't writing about my past. He was writing about my future. And what he asked me to do next would change not only my family, but the rest of my life. My hands trembled as I unfolded the final letter. The room had become so quiet that even the ticking of the old wall clock sounded loud. Everyone waited. Mom, Emily, my brother, Dad, Ethan. No one tried to hurry me. No one interrupted. For the first time in my life, my voice mattered enough that everyone was willing to wait. I looked down and began reading. "My sweet Lauren, if you've reached this letter, then you've already survived the hardest part of your journey. Not the rejection, not the loneliness, not even the years of believing you weren't enough. The hardest part was choosing not to become bitter." A tear rolled onto the page. I quickly brushed it away. "Life will hand you many reasons to close your heart. Don't. The world already has enough people who know how to hurt others. It needs more people who know how to heal them." I smiled through my tears. Those words sounded exactly like the stories I'd spent years writing for children. Maybe, without realizing it, I'd been carrying my grandfather's heart inside my own. "One day, your father will understand what he lost." I slowly looked toward Dad. His eyes never left the floor. "When that day comes, don't punish him by becoming someone who cannot forgive. Forgiveness is not saying the past didn't happen. Forgiveness is refusing to let the past choose your future." I stopped reading. The sentence settled deep inside me. For years, I'd imagined this moment differently. I thought if my father ever admitted he was wrong, I'd feel victorious. Instead, I just felt tired. Carrying pain for 7 years had become exhausting. I folded the letter carefully. No one spoke. Finally, Dad stood. He looked older than he had 24 hours earlier, as though regret had added another decade to his life overnight. He walked toward me until only a few feet separated us. "I've rehearsed this conversation in my head thousands of times." He laughed quietly, "but every version started with excuses." He shook his head. "I don't have any left." His voice trembled. "I spent my life believing achievement was the greatest gift a parent could give." He swallowed. "I forgot that love comes first." Tears streamed down his face. "I celebrated your sister's grades. I celebrated your brother's promotions. I celebrated my own career." Then he looked directly at me. "And somehow, I forgot to celebrate my daughter." No one moved, no one breathed. The room seemed suspended in time. "I wasn't raising children," he whispered. "I was chasing perfection." He closed his eyes, "and perfection cost me the one thing that actually mattered." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I asked the question that had lived inside me since I was 6 years old. "Dad," he slowly raised his head, "were you ever proud of me?" His face crumpled. "Every single day." The answer surprised everyone, including me. He continued, "I just didn't know how to say it." I frowned. "Why?" "Because every time I looked at you," he smiled sadly, "I saw kindness. I saw compassion. I saw imagination. They were things I had buried inside myself." His voice cracked, "and instead of protecting them, I convinced myself they weren't important." He wiped away another tear. I wasn't disappointed in you. I was disappointed in the man I'd become. Those words didn't erase my childhood. They couldn't, but they helped me understand it. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are fighting battles they never admit they lost. Dad slowly reached into his jacket pocket. I have something. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It isn't much. What is it? He handed it to me. I unfolded it, my breath caught. It was my first grade painting. The sunflower field. The same one I'd believed had been thrown away. The paper had been carefully restored. The colors were faded, the corners had been repaired. On the back in my father's handwriting were words I'd never seen before. I don't understand her gift yet, but I hope someday I will. Dated. 29 years earlier. I looked up stunned. You kept it, he nodded, in my desk, for all these years. I couldn't throw it away. Then why? My voice shook. Why didn't you tell me? He smiled through tears. Because I was a fool. There was no defense, only truth. Mom quietly laughed through her tears. Your grandfather found that painting hidden in your father's office. Dad smiled weakly. He scolded me for 20 minutes. What did he say? Dad chuckled softly. He told me, his voice caught. One day you'll realize that saving hearts outside the operating room is just as important. He looked at me. I wish I'd listened. Emily wrapped one arm around me. You know something? What? I used to envy you. I laughed in disbelief. You envied me. She nodded. You knew who you were. I spent years becoming who Dad wanted. She smiled. You became who you wanted. Daniel squeezed her shoulder. And that's why she's the happiest person in this room. Emily nodded. Exactly. My brother cleared his throat. I've already spoken with the children's wing at Boston General. I blinked. What? They want someone to redesign the healing spaces. I looked confused. The walls. The reading rooms. The family waiting areas. He smiled. I told them about your books. I stared at him. They want to use your artwork. I couldn't speak. They believe children deserve hope while they're healing. Tears filled my eyes again. For years, I'd been told my art couldn't change lives. Now, a hospital wanted it because it could. Life has a beautiful sense of irony. A month later, I returned to Boston, not to move back, just to begin the project. Every hallway filled with bright forests, friendly animals, colorful skis. Tiny hidden stars children could search for while waiting for treatment. Parents sent letters. Nurses thanked me. Children smiled despite difficult days. One little girl looked up at a painted fox on the wall and whispered, "He looks brave." Her mother smiled. I think he was scared. The little girl shook her head. You can be both. I smiled. She had understood the entire message. Dad volunteered every Saturday. Sometimes we'd eat lunch together afterwards. The conversations were awkward at first, then easier. We never pretended the past hadn't happened. We simply chose not to let it be the only thing we talked about. Healing wasn't dramatic, it was quiet. One conversation at a time, one apology at a time, one ordinary Saturday at a time. Mom visited New York often. She loved wandering through bookstores and secretly moving my books to the front display. I'd catch her doing it every single time. She'd laugh like a mischievous teenager. Oh. I was just helping. I never stopped her. Emily and I became sisters in the way we should have been all along. Not competitors, not comparisons, just sisters. Every Sunday, we had breakfast together over video calls. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we simply laughed. We were making up for years neither of us could get back. 6 months after the wedding, Ethan proposed. Not in a fancy restaurant, not on a mountaintop. He proposed in the elementary school library where I donated my very first book. Children's drawings covered every wall. He knelt beside the reading corner. You've spent your whole life helping people believe they deserve love. He smiled. I hope you'll let me spend the rest of mine reminding you that you do too. I said yes before he finished asking. On our wedding day, Dad asked if he could walk me down the aisle. I looked at him for a long time, then I smiled. I'd like that. As we stood waiting for the music to begin, he whispered, "Thank you." What for? For giving me a second chance I didn't deserve. I squeezed his arm. Don't waste it. I won't. And he never did. A year later, my newest book was released. It was dedicated to one person. The dedication read, "For Grandpa William, the first person who taught me that being loved and being understood are two different gifts. Thank you for giving me both." People still ask me if growing up in a family of doctors made me feel like a failure. I always smile. Then I tell them the truth. I was never the failure. I was simply the first person in my family brave enough to define success differently. And every now and then, when I visit the children's wing at Boston General Hospital, I see frightened little faces looking up at the colorful walls we created together. Some of those children smile. Some point excitedly at the hidden stars. Some forget, if only for a moment, that they're in a hospital. Whenever that happens, I think about my father. He spent decades saving hearts with his hands. I spent my life trying to heal them with stories. In the end, there was room in the world for both. And if my grandfather were standing beside me today, I think he'd smile that warm, familiar smile, then quietly remind me of the words that changed my life forever. Kindness is a legacy no one can take away. My name is Lauren Mitchell. This story is inspired by one of the hardest chapters of my life, but it isn't really about being called a failure. It's about discovering that your worth was never something another person had the power to give or to take away. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. Tell me about the door that opened for you. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.